when Canada defines, oh, we're not ready to negotiate region by region, well, each region has unique and distinct circumstances, right? That's culturally based, and we're not trying to hive off region by region negotiations. We're trying to resolve this overall, the whole of the tribunal's outcome. So collaboratively, as commissioners, we've come to the table with one objective, and that's to start negotiating new terms around how we, how do we implement that.
Pam Palmater, and I am the host of this show, The Warrior Life. I'm an Indigenous lawyer, professor, and author from Eel River Bar First Nation, and my motto is education for action. Action on Indigenous rights, social justice, and protecting the planet. In this podcast, you get an education of a totally different kind. It's all from the lived experiences, knowledge, expert insights, and creativity of Indigenous authors, activists, artists, leaders, land defenders, and water protectors. They're all on the front lines of Indigenous resistance, resurgence, and revitalization. And today's episode is going to be a particularly important one. We'll be hearing directly from Chief Pauline Frost about the National Children's Chief Commission and where we are on the negotiations for long-term reform on First Nation child and family services. So you really don't want to miss this one. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Warrior Life podcast. I'm your host, Pam Palmater, and today we get to hear from someone who I admire incredibly. She is a powerhouse. Chief Pauline Frost is someone that I have wanted to have on my podcast for a very, very long time. She's done a bazillion things, but just to hit the highlights, she has extensive experience in leadership and governance, both in the Yukon Territory and in her First Nation, including serving roles like Liberal MLA, Minister of Health and Social Services, Minister of the Environment, Minister responsible for Yukon Housing, as well as Chair of the Yukon Salmon Committee, the Vuntut Gwitchin negotiator and intergovernmental coordinator, and now she's the chief, and most recently she became chair of the National Children's Chief Committee so that we can move forward on the negotiations with long-term reform. It's an incredible CV, and that's literally a fraction of what she does. Welcome to the Warrior Life podcast, Chief Frost.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, it's such an honor to have you on my show. And I know the listeners are just going to be so happy because many people have been wanting to hear about your work and what you do. But before we kind of get into all the details, I'd love to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself, talk to us about your First Nation and your community, and maybe a little bit about your culture.
Okay, thank you. So much to talk about. So first about me, my name is Pauline Frost. I'm the chief of Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. I've been here now for 2 years, but I've been clearly actively involved in my government for many, many years. We are the only isolated community in the Yukon. Because of our isolation, I think it bodes well for our people, because we live still a subsistence lifestyle. So although we're a modern, progressive community, we rely and we live on very close to nature. We live on the land. We have our government. We have opportunities. We own a part of an airline, Air North, that flies all over Western Canada, and periodically flies to Ottawa. So we are active in that way. We have land that we've selected. We have category A and B land. So we control everything that we do on our lands, be it hunting, fishing, trapping, everything we do on our lands is really just to protect and sustain our way of life. We're not much for mineral development on our settlement land because we're trying to protect our way of life into the future. So I'm pleased to be the third female chief of my government. The first chief here in the community was Alice Frost, actually. She was my mom some 35 years ago. So I am excited. Lots of opportunities here in the community. We are an active community on a national and international scale, and we try to present, and help the world to better understand impacts and effects of climate change and adaptation and measures that affect circumpolar regions of the North. We participate on at all levels to ensure that we have, good representation and at any stage that presents itself for us to engage on.
That's incredible too, to hear that, you're following in your mom's footsteps. I love it when I hear that an activist was the daughter of another activist, or a chief, the son or daughter of another chief. Like, I just love that kind of commitment to leadership, which is not easy, just kind of follows on the family line. I love that. And I would actually love to talk to you about that, because what made you choose to become a chief? Was it the influence of your mom?
I would say, in the Yukon, there are 26 self-governing nations across the country, organizations. In the Yukon, we have 11. There's 14 communities here. And so it's imperative and incumbent on all of us to participate in good governance, but also to, ensure that we implement the obligations, the treaty obligations, and the duty and the honor of the Crown as we start negotiating and drawing down resources and programs and services. So the question you asked is, why did I decide to run for chief? Well, I was a minister in the Yukon government for going on 5 years. I worked as all at the same time, so it wasn't separately. So I health and social services, housing and environment at one time for the duration, so simultaneous responsibilities, which was huge. But when I finished that and we were going through renewal of our agreements here in the community, I was approached by a few elders to asking me if I would come back and just participate for a period of time. And so I agreed to do that, and I did it on the under the direction of the leadership of the elders to advance the interests of our people. So I was happy to do that.
That's awesome. And it's one of those positions that sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding around it. People think it's an easy job, or must be nice to be chief or on council, or it's just so easy, when we know behind the scenes you get the blame for everything that's bad. Even if it's the federal government or a territorial government's issue, you will be blamed for that. How do you manage some of those challenges of leadership? Because it's not as easy as sometimes people might think it is.
Yeah, very, very good question. I mean, and any public role that you play in society is not an easy one, because oftentimes there's misinterpretation. And generally speaking, as a chief, you don't make a decision, on your own. It has to be done by way of council authority, or you get mandate from your government, or you get mandate from your assembly. So you advance the interests of the people, and oftentimes there are external pressures that isn't really realized in the community. And so, if you think about the National Children's Chiefs Commission, for an example, ultimately, it will have direct detrimental impact and effect because it's Family Children Services Act reform, Jordan's Principles reform. You think about Arctic insecurity and Arctic sovereignty. Although you don't see it on the ground on the day-to-day administration of the government, they are still impactful and important. More the Gwitchin Council International, for an example. There are many external pressures, and so oftentimes there's a misunderstanding we just can't. I just got back from the the Land Claims Agreements Coalition, and the meetings that we had, leadership meetings we just had in Ottawa. And so I think about that. And so we have to be transparent. You have to be open. You need to keep dialogue happening all the time. And the dialogue we keep open is ensuring that any decision we make is uploaded onto our website so citizens can have access. And the important thing in my world, in our little community, there's only 250 people in my community, yet our citizenship list runs at about 1,000, right? And so you wonder, like of that 250, the rest of the citizens reside off of the traditional territory. So how do you keep all of the citizens informed and abreast of what's happening? So we do that by communications. I love this podcast idea. Maybe more of this would break some of those barriers. We just launched a brand new website here in Vuntut, Gwitchin. We use social media a lot, mostly to post notices out. We've taken recently to using Zoom as a way to communicate, but it's not very effective. And the reason for that is one, we have 3G connectivity still, and most of the world is at 5G. So right now, thanks to we have a little better connection at the office here, but most of the community is connected to 3G. Our cell phones are extremely slow, so you'll never be uploading anything onto social media, or it takes hours, or you do it in the middle of the night. So it's complicated, but it also is a saving grace sometimes, right? So we do as much as we can, utilize tools available to us, and I think about it every day, right? As I wind down my last cycle in office, is what do we do now with with our new budgets, right? You think about impacts and effects. The federal government prorogued Parliament. We hadn't renewed our fiscal transfer agreements. That means the new funding that's coming down, or that has evolved around that, and is frozen. So we don't have any new resources coming in, and we have to sign off on our transfer agreement. We do that every 5 years. So we negotiate renewal every 5 years, and they refer to it as a bump, and usually price, population, remoteness is taken into consideration. We set priorities, be it adult language immersion, infrastructure, climate, heritage, whatever we deem as priority, we get to the table and negotiate. So as a chief, you need to be informed of all of that, everything that is coming at you, and how do you then provide direction to your team so that they essentially can get to the necessary tables to negotiate. And so I would say that being a chief is a lot harder than being a minister of 3 departments, only because you work directly with your people. And as my mother so succinctly put it, she said, you can't please all of the people all the time. You can only please some of the people some of the time. But ultimately, our vision and our objective is to ensure that we have a good future for our children. We have environmental protection. We have remediation and action that is required on anything that we do on our traditional territory, and that we have resources for our young people. 7 generations from now, we want to ensure that they live the same lifestyle that we have today, and that we protect that for their benefit. So that's, in my view, I think essentially the role of a chief in a little Indigenous community in North Yukon.
Yeah. And for the listeners who might not know, your community is under a self-government agreement. So you're not under the same kinds of rules and regulations as the Indian Act. It's self-government. So effectively, you're doing federal work, provincial, territorial, like all the kinds of responsibilities that governments have you have. One of the things, like, and you mentioned a lot in your community and other chiefs across the country, they have to deal with a lack of clean running water in some communities, not all. Some communities have high rates of suicide. Some have high levels of poverty. Some have violence against women. Like, all First Nations are different. How do you come around to saying, okay, we've also got to deal with this foster care crisis for our kids? How is it that you've been able to make this a priority when there's so many things going on in addition to all the governance and laws and environmental protection? What is it about our kids that makes it so important that we put them as a priority?
You know, the children are the future, and, you know, apprehending and holding children in centers that are not conducive to good learning or healthy, you know, upbringing. And we often say that you must know who you are, where you come from, and know your identity in order to be successful. And when you have children in centers that hold them essentially, you know, that they're not accustomed to, it compromises their identity. It compromises them as young children, and the relationship with culture is not there. And so how did this come to be? When I was the Minister of Health and Social Services, one of the key priorities we spoke about was Indigenous children in care, and how is it that we can address supporting a foster system or a foster care system or an extended care system. So a good example I'll use for me as a minister and what I did in Yukon is that when there's a tranche of money that came over from the federal government, I believe it was $7.2 million that came across my desk as a health minister. And my question to my staff is, what exactly is this for? What mandate does this come with? What is the criteria for this funding envelope that's defined as family preservation? And the response I received was, well, this is meant for Indigenous children. And I said, well, why are we sitting on this money? Because it doesn't belong in a bureaucratic system that is not attuned not attuned and not responsible for Indigenous children, other than apprehending and retaining children. So why don't we turn it over to the central organization that's ultimately responsible, and have them design appropriate service program and services for Indigenous children? And so the funding envelope flowed over to CYFN, and you'll see if you go just directly to the CYFN website, you refer to the Family Preservation Unit, seed money flows over. It no longer flows through a government entity, public government entity. And so that's one tool. The other thing that happened was that we looked at the children in care. Children that are apprehended across this country, if you look at Manitoba or the Prairie provinces, some of the provinces have 11,000 children in government institutions, and they're Indigenous children. And you look at reconciliation, you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the outcomes from that, the recommendation, it's all about in the 60s scoop. How do we essentially look for, at reclaiming our rights, but also addressing the crises that we're in, because we cannot just keep taking the children. And so when I was a minister, we had something like 500 children in care, in foster care, or in some sort of a group home setting. The first thing we did was to look at an extended family care agreement. So if you think about Indigenous ways, well, in every community, in every culture, grandparents raise grandchildren all the time. And so I'm grateful that I had the teachings of the ancestors from my grandmother, and some of us had the great fortune of being grounded in that way. But we also know that our grandparents and the elders and seniors in our society, some of them don't receive a full-on pension because just because of life choices, and choosing to live a subsistence way of life, while most of the community members I have here that didn't live outside community don't get a pension from an organization. They get pension from the federal government. How do you live above the poverty line on a old age security and CPP? That's not possible, and let alone raising your grandchildren. And so the family extension program, or extended family care program, it allows support to the families. We have Jordan's principles, we have the family preservation, we have funding flowing out in different ways, but ultimately the end of the day is how do we support, because custom adoption is the practice of our nation. It's not formal adoption. It's not fostering. It's custom adoption. Is a grandparent or an auntie or an uncle will take a child and raise that child as their own. But we don't go to a formal, let's go to the courts and do a formal adoption. But you still have to think about that, because it's cultural. It's our way. It's our Indigenous Dingijuk way. And so barriers of equity and transparency. How do you ensure that every child is given, food, nutritious foods to eat every day, fresh water, clean water, shelter? And so the question is, why am I involved? Because every child matters. Every child across this country should matter, because they are the future. They're valuable, and they absolutely hold a part of our past, and they will hold a part of the future. And it's up to us as Indigenous leaders, to fight that fight for them. It's not something that I take lightly either. It's something that I vowed to ensure that my grandchild and the grandchildren that are around me will, have better access. So avoid and remove discrimination, whatever barriers there are. And I think the Human Rights Tribunal and the outcomes, thanks to the Caring Society and Cindy Blackstock for leading that charge. We have a ways to go, but I think we're 3/4 of the way there. We just have to get to the federal table. We have, the tribunal's outcome and the recommendations, and now we just need to advance and assert our relationship with Canada, with the National Chiefs Commission and AFN, and bridge that gap, and then get to the table to start, defining some new terms around the services that are delivered to our children.
Exactly. Like, when I think about that on this podcast and on my YouTube channel, I have had a large number of experts and activists and people like Cindy Blackstock and others who have been involved in how do we end the discrimination against First Nations children and the families, because this is about supporting families. They've been on to explain the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision, federal court decisions, all the back and forth to get us to here. And as we know, the compensation agreement was settled, and that part is taken care of. The payments will roll out at some point. But here we are. We seem to be a little bit stuck on long-term reform settlement. And I'm wondering, just for the people who might not know, because a lot of people are listening because they want more information, I'm wondering if you could just tell them a little bit about, okay, this first draft settlement agreement, there was a few things that just wasn't sitting well with the majority of chiefs. So it wasn't just one or two people, but the majority of chiefs who met at that assembly said, you know what, we have some concerns about this agreement that might not be in our best interest. Could you just talk about those a little bit?
So let's focus for a bit around the Human Rights Tribunal, the reform on family children services. What we know to be factual is that the service deliveries is challenged, and that children are not being treated equally and fairly across this country. There's discrimination. The ruling is quite clear. Canada has an obligation, and so the negotiations followed that with AFN, CU, and NAN, and Caring Society was there early on. The objective really was to try to address, mechanisms through the bureaucratic process of how do we break those barriers down and start working with our Indigenous communities. And accountability back then is very weak. So how do we redefine the accountability tools? And so there was a motion on the floor in October, and the motion on the floor of the Chiefs in Assembly on October 18th and 19th was really to accept, reject, or modify, essentially, in simple terms. And the Yukon First Nations, I have to admit, I've never been to an AFN assembly or a meeting of chiefs prior to October. And the only reason I showed up there was obviously I had some grave concerns around the $47.8 billion and what was involved in that long, extensive document that took a lot of time to read and analyze. But it really just I think what it said is that, in a nutshell, that the transparency was not there. They referred to as agencies, agencies reporting and delivering services. And for me, an agency is the government of Yukon. That's who the agency would be to deliver services. And if that seems to be the barrier, and if you think the $7.2 million we transferred over to the Family Preservation Unit for Indigenous children, we're going to turn that all back to the agency to manage for us? It's not possible. So how is it that new funds and new methodologies that are going to come down with respect to treaty negotiations and allocation, is it appropriate to run that through a public government? No, it isn't, because the First Nations haven't had input on that. We haven't even defined. They would not even know the scope of practice, nor would they know, our registry information, our data, other than who they have in their care right now. And so the role, I think, of First Nations at the time, as we looked at it, it didn't talk about there was some language in there around service delivery and avoidance of just further discrimination. And the federal court made a really clear decision on the settlement process. But what we found, and what the majority of the chiefs found in assembly, is that it referred to services for children on reserve. Well, there are no reserves in the Yukon. We're settled or unsettled. You're either managed by Indigenous Services Canada, or you manage your own capacity under your Crown Indigenous relationship. So we were not even contemplated in that whole outcome, nor was NWT. There was not even a mention of that. So I showed up at the table with the Yukon Chiefs, with the objective of rewriting the resolution that was on the floor of the Assembly with a new proposal. There had to be a non-derogation clause in there that the Human Rights Tribunal outcomes will apply to our self-government agreements. That we had to get language in there that, that we had to remove it away from AFN, because AFN is really, they agreed to a certain aspect of the agreement that would, evolve in a way that may not be incorporating all of the regions, all of the various regions, because it was, in some jurisdictions you didn't have representation, and it wasn't going to happen through this process. So there were some challenges. I would say there are successes also, right? Because the Human Rights Tribunal was very successful in coming out with recommendations that redefined, and it wasn't a full-on rejection. And I have to make that known, because we cannot say that the chiefs rejected. We didn't reject anything. We said we needed to get back to the drawing board and redefine the principles of negotiation that is conducive to our core needs. And that negotiations have to involve, the communities and the nations that have been left off of the table or left out of the discussions that have evolved. So how do we get involved? There has to be a solution, and the solution that came to be was, coming away with some draft resolution, and I'll refer to resolution 60 and 61 that establish this new organization or this new branch of AFN, which is the National Children's Chiefs Commission. Then they set some clear parameters around that, clear mandates, and so that's kind of how this came to be. And
again, we have a situation where there's a lot of different people making commentary in the media, some who are involved, some who aren't involved. You know, sometimes when non-Native people are out there doing political commentary in the news, they don't always know exactly what they're talking about. And some of the things I've heard is that, like you were saying, oh, the chiefs threw away this entire settlement, which wasn't the case. You wanted some amendments. And then the other thing they were saying is, clearly the chiefs aren't ready. They're not capable of coming to the table to negotiate. But it would seem to me that the resolutions didn't just say, no, we don't like this, and everybody walked away. It needs some amendments. There's some good parts. So in order to make sure that we address those, we're going to create this National Children's Chief Committee, and we're ready to come to the table. Have I got that wrong? Or are the chiefs, in fact, ready to come back to the table?
I'm ready. I'm chair of the National Children's Chiefs Commission. I want to say that, the rejection that was put forward was not a rejection. It was, let's redraft, let's come back to the table, and let's come with some concrete solutions on how to move forward in a respectful way, and that we incorporate and we involve everyone that's affected by the Human Rights Tribunal outcome. So the solution that came forward from the October and December Special Chiefs and Assembly meeting was really to establish a mechanism. And one of the solutions was to create the National Children's Chiefs Commission to move forward with negotiations. So that in itself tells the country, and it tells Canada, and it tells our partner. It informs and acknowledges that we are ready. And the committee itself, I can say that we have, everyone's highly committed and educated, and Canada has lawyers. Well, we have lawyers. Canada has negotiators. We have negotiators. They have their minister. Well, we have our chiefs. Right, we're going to counter in every which way, and we've heard, some comments in the media that says majority of chiefs rejected. Well, let's say the majority of the chiefs didn't reject it. The majority of the chiefs redefined a scope, and if you look at the resolutions, it clearly lays out the mandate, a new mandate going forward, and that new mandate is what we're building our relationship on with Canada. And it's building our relationship with the Assembly of First Nations, right? Because we are a subset of AFN. It came out of the Chiefs Assembly, therefore we have an obligation to the Chiefs and Assembly to report back on the success, right? And the model of approach going forward.
Exactly. And ultimately, the AFN isn't just this administrative body. When the Chiefs and Assembly, the majority of chiefs in assembly, make a decision, here's how we're going to proceed, then you would think Canada would listen very carefully. Now, another question I get lots is, okay, who does the National Children's Chief Commission, is there a nationwide representation? Is it only one or two regions? Is there representation from the regions across Canada?
Well, absolutely, right. The National Children's Chiefs Commission in the Assembly and the Chiefs in Assembly made it very clear that the commission is to have representation from the regions. So each region appointed a commissioner, and majority of the commissioners are chiefs. They're either they represent the regions. We have our regional chiefs that sit on the executive of the AFN, and we have majority of the chiefs that are absolutely 100% behind us as well. So along with that, we have commissioner. They were defined or refer to ourselves as commissioners, and we, the requirement of a successful agreement means that we need to work together across the country. And so we meet every Friday. all of the commission meets every Friday. We check in, we do our meetings, we are formally organized. We have our terms of reference for the commissioners, so really define scope of how we're going to move forward. And then we have a negotiating team, and that negotiating team came out of the resolutions as well. We've defined the terms of reference for that committee as well, so we don't ever deviate off track, that we stay on track, and that we follow the principles of negotiations. We follow the principles as it's laid out for us in the Human Rights Tribunal. But accountability, again, will go back into the chiefs in assembly. So we had a specific timeline, and really we want to see success, and we want to see it as urgent. It's an urgent matter. It's an urgent matter for the country, and we have to restore good faith, right? The good faith that we have with Canada. They're in a tumultuous time right now with potential election, new Liberal leader coming on. We've written letters across the board to every possible minister, to the Prime Minister. We've written letters to Jagmeet Singh and Pierre Poilievre, and really not trying to politicize this in any way. We have not to, and we cannot politicize this. We have to think about it as to make a long-term reform transparent. We have to remove any political involvement, and just how do we as chiefs and as a commission mandate down to our negotiating team to get back to the table and work to incorporate some meaningful oversight into the recommendations. And because what we heard from Canada and from Minister Hadju is that they don't have a mandate. Canada does not have a mandate to negotiate with regions. They only have a mandate to go to Chiefs of Ontario, because that was the outcome in the ruling. We ventured to say that under the Chiefs and Assemblies resolution, that Canada has an obligation to work with us, because AFN was originally a part of the submission and the outcomes. And if AFN has a mandate, then clearly the NCCC is a part of AFN. Therefore, we would then take on that jurisdictional right and responsibility. That's the objective, not to look for putting up more walls and barriers to have us fight one another or resolve this between each other. It's pretty evident and clear for me. Preserving mandate and the independence, and bringing in the expert advisors that we need, that have more experience than myself, and more experience in lead negotiations and transforming and reforming Indigenous services for our children. We can't run it through Indigenous Services Canada anymore. They've already have the 47.8 billion, and there's a specific ruling and a specific outcome from the tribunal. Let's get to the table.
Yeah. It's so disingenuous to say they don't have a mandate to negotiate with regions when they just negotiated with a region. And that's not to pit regions against one another, but the whole original agreement was for all of these regions, and now you say you don't have a mandate. It doesn't seem like good faith. And one of the things that we talk about on this podcast sometimes are some of the things that the Supreme Court of Canada has told Canada to do. Don't litigate Indigenous rights and issues, negotiate. Act honorably. Always put the honor of the Crown first. Understand that you have fiduciary obligations to act in our best interest. And then, so importantly, when you do negotiate, make sure they're good faith negotiations, and a take it or leave it offer. Here, sign off or you get nothing. In all the laws that I have ever studied, that's a classic example of a bad faith negotiation. So it sounds like from everything you're saying is, hey, let's just come back to the table. Let's just engage in good faith negotiations. We're mostly there. We just need to make some amendments to make sure it's open, transparent, and represents the diverse interests across the country. I mean, it seems like that's what you're asking for. Good faith negotiations come back to the table.
Yeah. Well, I would say in the last correspondences we received from the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, what we're seeing is that they are also losing patience, right, with this process. And, I think as we look at when Canada defines, oh, we're not ready to negotiate region by region, well, each region has unique and distinct circumstances, right? That's culturally based, and we're not trying to hive off region by region negotiations. We're trying to resolve this overall, the whole of the tribunal's outcome. So collaboratively, as commissioners, we've come to the table with one objective, and that's to start negotiating new terms around how we, how do we implement that. If it looks to that we deal with self-governing nations as a separate approach, as we look at off-reserve agreements as a separate requirement, well, that will become a part of the negotiations. And we have to find a pathway, productive pathway. Canada has to find a productive pathway as well, because we cannot put up more barriers. What do we do about bringing down the barriers for them to come to the table to say that they don't have, mandate? Well, let's find a mandate. Let's find a productive pathway forward to negotiate. And I want to just say that the one thing we got back from the letter campaign is we really received a positive response from Jagmeet Singh, who strongly is in support of the commission up to this point. We've not received that from the Liberal government, and I'm frankly disappointed. As you see, I sat in the Yukon Territorial Government as a Liberal minister, and I worked with the Liberal government, obviously, during that time. I worked with Patty Haidju, I've worked with Ananda Sangri and all of them. And I don't want us to get into a political battle with them, but I do want to say that the Commission has full confidence in the agreement that the agreement, the recommendations. We have full confidence that we can resolve this, and we have the right people at the table to advance it. So let's talk about a renewed negotiation and starting it as soon as possible. And that's what we've been asking Canada to do, is, seek mandate. If you don't have one, seek mandate, and let's get to the table. But, in light, of course, the proroguing of Parliament and the new leadership race, it doesn't mean that the government just stops its process. They already have certainty and clarity in the outcomes. There is no need for them to go back. They just need to make a decision and implement appropriately. And, am I wrong? Are we wrong? I'd say absolutely not. I think we have every right to force the hand of Canada and then encourage them to, and do it in a good way, because your point is we don't want to end up in litigation. No. Do we litigate again? Because that'll tie us up for another how many years, right? We're reviewing the Jordan's Principles right now, the delivery. That in itself is identical to the Family Children Services reform and the outcomes. So Canada will just end up in this cycle. How do you break the cycle? Engage with us and get to the table and give us some, give us the resources, and don't send us back to the drawing table and try to vet us against AFN, because we are AFN. We are a product of the Chiefs and Assembly.
So important. And I'm so glad to hear that, because I think most of us, we've got lots of critique of all different governments over the last 500 years, federal, provincial, municipal. But at the end of the day, there was significant hope that there would be a resolution to this agreement, that negotiations would just continue. It's not like they're burning the draft and you have to start from square one on page one with you've got big chunks that seem to be in a line. It's other things that just need to be addressed. That's what I don't get. What's with the no mandate?
Well, I think as part of our self-government agreement in the Yukon, we go through this exercise every 5 years. They don't have a mandate to negotiate Aboriginal language revitalization. We don't have a mandate for Indigenous housing. We don't have a mandate. Well, so we go through this renewal exercise every 5 years. And the first one we went through, it took us 9 years. And then, and now we have had a 2-year extension because we couldn't meet, we couldn't come to a concluding decision on renewal of our fiscal transfer agreement. We signed off for 5 years with the objective of coming back to the table. So we are familiar with no mandate response. On this particular one, though, with the Family Children Services, the mandate is there. It's clear, and it's clearly laid out through the Human Rights Tribunal. They have the mechanism. They have the, decision-making authority, the accountability. We have it all established and structured in such a way that, Canada just needs to make a decision and get back to the table. We can then have a collective negotiations through the National Children's Chiefs Commission, through the negotiating team, and then we can have a discussion about regional impacts and effects. I don't think we're trying to go one off on each other and negotiate, for Yukon or Northwest Territories or BC, or we branch ourselves. That would be divisive in nature, and that's not our objective. So I think Canada getting to the table, having a negotiated session with the Commission as a whole will resolve and I think appease their concerns around, lack of authority or mandate for regional negotiations. Because we can have one collective negotiations, and we can decide then, the secondary component to what this negotiation measure would look like, similar to what they just did in Ontario. What tool did they use? What does the funding methodology look like? How did they resolve that? Because that will set precedent on what negotiations look like into, for us in the future. Because as we know, not every chief agreed in Ontario either. Like that was kind of split. So relationships are important. The successful agreements need to, defined by way of the resolutions that came out of the Assembly. And I think we have a good path forward. It's just unfortunately challenged right now.
Needs some good faith. Faith on the part of the government.
We are optimistic, absolutely optimistic.
I can't thank you, but also everyone that's on the National Children's Chiefs Commission. The fact that children is in the title just shows what we're talking about. Strip away the politics or egos or personalities or whatever, and just remember it's for all of our children. And so that's a lot of work. And I know there's lots of people who support what's happening. There's always going to be people who don't support. So I know it's a hard job. As we round out this podcast, what can people like me do? First Nations citizens, what can we do to support your Children's Chiefs Commission? What can we do to help educate the rest of our members? Like, do you have any advice for us? What do you need from us to do?
Well, I think it's important to educate yourselves, participate in your Indigenous governments. I think it's important to show up at the assemblies, be informed, look at the Human Rights Tribunal outcomes and the recommendations, and encourage your MLA, encourage your minister, encourage the federal minister. We're pushing up against the federal election. Now it's a good time to have that discussion as one of the platform items, right? Ensure that jurisdiction and responsibilities rest with First Nations. They are our children. They're not the product, and they're not children of Canada doesn't control that. These are our children. Therefore, we are responsible for ensuring that we protect our children's rights. And you have a responsibility as Indigenous people of this country. We have a responsibility as chiefs. We're only your voice, and so we need your support, and we need you to get educated. And as well, I would like to just say that the commissioners that are sitting on the commission are They're wonderful people. They're dedicated to their, their roles as chiefs or, as negotiators. They're all there, and every one of us that's at the table we're not getting paid for this. We have lawyers at the table that are working pro bono because they are passionate. And the Chiefs Commission right now has had no resources to finance itself because we have not been able to get access to the funding to allow us to do the work. We've been doing this, at the side, on top of everything else we're doing. So I want to just say that if we could do it, and we could do it, at this level, everyone can get involved. Don't feel that there's no opportunity for you to be involved. There's huge opportunities. There's we don't have a whole lot of time left. Who knows what happens with the next federal election, but the outcomes are pretty solid. We have an agreement that branches out 10 years, and then the funding actually, I think, flows over every year, and it's done by way of parliamentary funding or government, subject to unspecified government approval processes. But we have a 10-year commitment. So let's get that, because time is ticking and 10 years will come and go before we know it. If we don't resolve it, 1 year's almost gone already. That means we have 9 years left. Let's get on top of it.
Oh my goodness, whole lifetimes of children are on the table. I can't thank you enough. It has been such an honor to talk to you, and I learned things just talking to you today, and I've been doing lots of research on this. So that's why it's so important to get information and talk to people and do self-education on this issue. Thanks again for joining me on this podcast. And if there is anything that we can do, you want to talk again, if you want to, have a live session on YouTube because there's updates or anything, know that I am always here to support your good work.
Thank you. I so appreciate this opportunity. I think any opportunity to raise the profile, speak about our children, I think we, welcome this opportunity. So thank you also for reaching out.
Thank you to all the listeners for listening, watching, reading closed captions. Press this, push this far and wide, share it with as many people as possible. Push everyone you know that's in government to take action on this. Come back to the table, negotiate in good faith. Till next time, keep living a warrior life. Walalia.